się przyśni.
500 metrów stąd.
500 meters from here, on Belvederska Street, there is the embassy of the Russian Federation. The Dom Polski restaurant was located in this building for many years. After the 10th of April 2010, meetings were held in this restaurant between representatives of the Federal Security Service of the Special Service, from which Vladimir Putin comes, and representatives of the Military Counterintelligence Service. These meetings were initiated by the Russian side, and their location was not accidental. These two buildings belonged to Russia for years. This was the official headquarters of first the NKVD, and later, until 1990, the KGB. There was a Russian detention center and a direct radio communication with Moscow in this place. The Russian intelligence school was located in this building for years.
Po przejęciu obu budynków
After taking over both buildings from the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the Soviet services quickly adapted them to their needs. According to one account, equipment enabling direct radio communication with Moscow was installed in the Red Villa, and one of the rooms was adapted into a small detention center. In order to not reveal the actual purpose of this building, a plaque was placed on it, informing that it houses the commercial office of the Soviet embassy. The KGB representative office operated in this place until 1990. Both buildings were used by Russia on the basis of a special agreement signed by the Russian KGB with the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Poland, then ruled by communists. Several dozen years later, as a result of meetings held in this place, the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation signed an agreement with the Military Counterintelligence Service. The agreement, accepted by Donald Tusk and Vladimir Putin.
I Władimir Putin. W grudniu
In December 2011, an agreement between Poland and the Russian Federation was signed in Moscow. Under this agreement, citizens of the Russian Federation without visas could enter Poland through this and other border crossings. The issue of local border traffic appeared for the first time at the very beginning of the reset talks between Poland and Russia. The first meeting in Brussels between Sergei Lavrov and Radosław Sikorski at the end of 2007, when Radosław Sikorski took over as Minister of Foreign Affairs, concerned this very issue.
objął funkcję ministra spraw zagranicznych, dotyczyła właśnie tej kwestii.
We've agreed that expert talks will be held in the first quarter of next year on the possibility of a bilateral agreement on local border traffic. Lavrov emphasized the great interest in the topic due to Kaliningrad. In order to open the Schengen area, it was necessary to convince the countries that did not want it, such as Lithuania and Sweden. To achieve that, an entire diplomatic plan had to be created at the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. With the support of Germany, it was successful. As part of bilateral contacts, the Polish side managed to obtain support for the correction of the regulation of such countries in the European Union as Germany and France during the meeting of the foreign ministers of the Weimar Triangle and Russia in Paris on the 23rd of June 2010. In the context of possible discrepancies among the ministers of various member states, it is advisable to consider Poland conducting the debate within the European Union in such a way that only large member states, especially Germany and France, and those with local border traffic, would take a position on the amendment. Although majority voting applies to this instrument, however, due to the sensitivity of the matter, political resistance from several member states could lead to the failure of the amendment. The foreign ministers of Poland and Russia signed an agreement on local border traffic in Moscow. The practical result will be that 1 million Russian citizens will be able to travel visa-free to parts of the European Union for the first time. And several 100,000 Poles that will cross the border with Russia on similar terms. The agreement covers the entire Kaliningrad Oblast and, on the Polish side, part of the powiats of the Warmian-Mazurian Voivodeship, as well as the Tri-City and 4 powiats of the Pomeranian Voivodeship. Visa abolition is a goal of exceptional importance to us. It is the beginning of the road to liberalisation of travel rules between, we hope, all of Russia and the European Union. The opening of visa-free traffic between Poland and Russia was presented by those ruling the Republic of Poland at that time as a spectacular success. However, this move caused threats that no one in power wanted to talk about out loud. During one of the conversations, Patrushev says to General Kozier, who was already the head of the National Security Bureau, i.e. after 2010, that it would be worth extending the concept of visa-free traffic to the Western Pomerania, the whole of northern Poland, the road to Germany. Yes, the Republic of Poland is opening up to, one could say directly, to all threats related to the de facto uncontrolled influx of Russians who enter the Schengen zone. They carry out various types of tasks. They recognize and update data on critical infrastructure on a very large scale. A scale that goes into the tens of thousands of people, that doesn't really filter anyone anymore because of the super-liberal politics. No one is able to carry out verification activities at this scale. The consulate in Kaliningrad does not, I would say, conduct any organised checks that would really verify who applies for a visa. Tri-City is one of the strategically and geopolitically most important places in the world. And now Russians living several dozen kilometers away are supposed to come here and check what the situation is like and what it looks like. In the context of the war in Ukraine and the ability of Russian troops to find their way in the area they would occupy, we now see how crucial this is. And those young Russians who were in Sopot at that time also saw what was happening. They saw where they would probably attack, where the landing would take place. Small border traffic and visa-free traffic also caused a direct intelligence threat to which military units located in the area where the Russians could move freely were exposed. Pilot General Dariusz Wronski commanded a military unit located in the area covered by local border traffic.
Dla dowódcy jednostki wojskowej to był bardzo nerwowy I dramatyczny praktycznie.
For the commander of a military unit, it was a very nervous and dramatic period, because almost on every flight we had a strange incidents. We saw civilian cars approaching which were not hiding at all, with plates starting with the number 39, that is registered in the Königsberg region.
Czyli przynależnych do obwodu królewskiego I zatrzymywanie się.
They stop for several dozen minutes or so, staying in an area where movement is prohibited. Entry of anyone is prohibited.
Kogokolwiek, a tu proszę rosyjski samochód.
And here I have a Russian car, 2 or 3 men in their prime, not just some youngsters who got lost, with great photographic and recording equipment.
Świetnym sprzętem fotograficznym z możliwością rejestracji.
And we managed to catch and intercept such people several times after identifying them. Well, the documents prove it. They were allowed in. I was never informed about what happened next.
I ja nigdy nie byłem informowany o tym, co dalej z tym się działo.
Co człowiek, który jest wyposażony
What can a
w to
person who is equipped with good recording and photographing equipment achieve, or what can his boss learn from photos taken in such a place near an airport of this type? What information can he draw from this?
wyciągnąć z tego informacji?
Zleceniodawcy czy ludzie, którzy mieli zadania obserwacji.
Principals or people who had tasks, observations and knowledge about the functioning of military units, in this case an aviation unit.
Mogli w bardzo łatwy sposób.
They could acquire this basic information very easily. How much and how well are the pilots trained, what tasks they perform, what tasks they perform in their zones.
Zadania w strefach przecież również są wykonywane loty na.
There are also flights performed over the sea or weather conditions that prevailed at a given moment. Do the pilots perform their tasks? If so, at what low cloud base? At what visibility? So they obtain the information that is needed during combat operations.
Działań bojowych.
Rosjanie zaczęli rozpoznawać czy przerzucać tutaj.
Russians began reconnaissance and started transferring here operators from their special services, both civilian and military.
Rozpoznawać infrastrukturę krytyczną, rozpoznawać przejścia graniczne.
They investigated the critical infrastructure and border crossings. They started to approach and register people and border guard soldiers, reaching them and trying to recruit them.
Zaczęli rozpoznawać jednostki wojskowe.
They began to investigate military units, air traffic, and what was happening around Polish military ports.
W okolicach portów wojennych polskich.
What's more, they set up many dead hiding places, which, as someone once told me, are still being found by Polish services today.
Odnajdywane przez polskie służby właśnie na
Exactly in border areas, to arrange contacts with their agents.
do łącznikowania po prostu własnej agentury.
Bezwizowy ruch.
Visa-free traffic between Poland and Russia and its Königsberg region, called Kaliningrad by the Russians, was maintained until the last days of the Civic Platform's rule. After the invasion of Crimea, Donald Tusk said the following words.
Mały ruch graniczny
No, local border traffic is not at risk, and no one will convince me that great events and great conflicts between Russia and Ukraine, the conflict over Crimea, would have influenced our decision some time ago to establish small border traffic.
ruchu granicznego. Bardzo dokładnie, bardzo
We distinguish very carefully, very precisely between what is happening between ordinary people who want to visit their towns on both sides of the border, do some trade, some tourism, some shopping, from what is the background and basis of this very serious crisis.
podłożem tego bardzo poważnego kryzysu. Nasz sposób postępowania wobec turystów
Our way of dealing with tourist buyers who come from the Kaliningrad district to this local border traffic area to Poland is not to make them feel in any way what we also feel and what we do not hide about the decisions of Russian politicians.
nie ukrywamy wobec decyzji rosyjskich polityków. Bo to jest ważne i dla tych ludzi, i dla nas.
Because it is important both for these people and for us. It is important to show that normal relations between people, entrepreneurs and traders do not have to be exposed to such earthquakes just because someone in Moscow came up with a few such imperial ideas.
Wpadł na parę takich imperialnych pomysłów.
The visa-free regime was closed by the decision of the Minister of Interior and Administration, Mariusz Błaszczak, on the 4th of July 2016.
Przepisy o małym ruchu
The
granicznym.
local border traffic regulations also covered towns such as Kadynia, right on the Vistula Lagoon, several kilometers from the Polish-Russian border. The very people who implemented the reset policy and the secret services wrote in documents that the introduction of these rules in this part of Poland would constitute a threat to state security. The visa-free regime was maintained despite the fact that the military counterintelligence in its top-secret reports warned the most most important people in the country against further implementation of such a policy. The warning went out to, among others, Tomasz Siemionak, Jacek Ciechocki, Radosław Sikorski, Stanisław Kozioł, Mieczysław Cienucha, and Krzysztof Bodnarek. A significant increase in the intelligence activities of the special services of the Russian Federation in the area of investigation of the Polish army units and allied installations in the region, the involvement of the Russian Federal Security Service in conducting active operational activities in the territory of the Republic of Poland, our greater exposure of Western European areas to the intelligence activities of the Russian Federation services, and the border zones of the Republic of Poland and the entire Kaliningrad Oblast across the border under visa-free traffic regime may, in the opinion of the military counterintelligence services, result in a significant increase in the operational capabilities of special services in the territory of the Republic of Poland.
Paradoksem całej tej sytuacji z tak zwanym małym ruchem granicznym, który okazał się wcale nie taki mały,
The paradox of this whole situation with the so-called small border traffic, which turned out to be not so small at all, is that even those who decided to reset the Polish-Russian secret services, I'm thinking here about General Janusz Nosek, at a certain stage of managing the military counterintelligence service, accepted the recommendations submitted by their subordinates.
podwładnych i sporządzić pismo skierowane do
and prepared a letter addressed to the highest state officials in which Nosek wrote for conducting advanced reconnaissance and intelligence activities by the Russian Federation and its services.
Stał się trampoliną, pasem transmisyjnym do prowadzenia zaawansowanych działań o charakterze rozpoznawczo-wywiadowczym.
The content of this document is so devastating that General Nosek, who signed it, had probably realized that it basically overturned the entire philosophy of the reset, as the entire philosophy of the Polish-Russian relations was established at the highest level.
Filozofię resetu, całą filozofię relacji polsko-rosyjskich, przecież ustalaną na najwyższym szczeblu, na poziomie rozmów prezydentów
at the level of talks between Presidents Komorowski and Medvedev, Prime Ministers Tusk and Putin, Foreign Ministers Sikorski and Lavrov, and had decided to add at the end of this document that perhaps his thesis was very sharp and far-fetched, but he would prefer to treat them as a kind of prognostics that may, in the future, be filled with such catastrophic content as he had expressed in his document.
która może w przyszłości po prostu, że tak powiem, wypełnić się tak katastroficzną treścią, jaką on tutaj ujął w tym dokumencie.
It should be noted that the main theses contained in this document are of prognostic nature. The probability of the described threats depends on economic, political and geographical factors in bilateral relations. Good morning, Mr. President. How are you feeling before the interrogation?
Brak mi doświadczeń.
I have no experience. I'm a little nervous, of course. We have a recording which shows that in 2012 there was consent to cooperate with the Russian intelligence. I will talk to the prosecutor's office about these matters today. We will explain all issues regarding the procedures. However, as for the political assessment of the work of the Polish services at that time, I do not have the slightest reservations. If the cooperation began in 2010, was it done without your consent and knowledge? In matters relating to the investigation itself, I will, of course, answer to prosecutors. Forgive me, ladies and gentlemen, but the matter of the work of the Secret Service is not the domain of public debates. Mr. Prime Minister, one more question. Was there cooperation between the SKW and the FSB Russian services? I will speak on this matter today in the prosecutor's office. But already in 2010? Donald Tusk certainly deserves some credit from Polish citizens. It should be given to him, especially today, when he's under attack. Fraud, liar, traitor.
Persona non grata!
Persona non grata, scammers and thieves. Donald Tusk is a mere continuator of the Ribbentrop-Molotov policy and should be in prison. Isn't this a manifestation, this opposition, a bit of an exaggeration? What will you say about it? I am not its organizer. You could have come by car. The weather is nice. Are you satisfied with what is happening? On the 19th of April 2017, Donald Tusk, President of the European Council, was summoned to the Military Prosecutor's Office in Warsaw. He was to testify not only about the agreement that journalists asked him about, but above all, about informal, unrecorded meetings that had been held for a long time between people of the military counterintelligence services and the Russian Federal Security Service. These talks led to the signing of the agreement, which was agreed to by Vladimir Putin, a member of the FSB on the Russian side, and by Prime Minister Donald Tusk on the Polish side.
Polskiej premier Donald Tusk.
When, on the 10th of April 2010, the information about the death of 96 people over the Smolensk airport reached Poland, a government plane with experts on board flew to Russia. Among them were people working on the other side of the Alenia Podległości in Warsaw, in the building where the National Commission for Aircraft Accidents Investigation is located, but also from the military secret services, including military counterintelligence services, people who work on Oczki Street on a daily basis. These people, at least theoretically, flew to Russia to take care of the Polish interests there.
Zadbać o polskie interesy.
10 kwietnia 2010
10th of April 2010 is a breakthrough. Among other things, this was the first time that cooperation, one could say not formalized but still semi-official, was established between the Polish secret services and the Russian main secret service, the Federal Security Service.
Główną służbą specjalną, czyli Federalną Służbą Bezpieczeństwa. Doszło najpewniej na terenie Federacji Rosyjskiej, zwłaszcza
There were probably incidents in the territory of the Russian Federation, especially in Moscow, in the relations of Polish officers with the Federal Security Service, i.e., firstly, official the Polish side reported that several officers of the Military Counterintelligence Service would appear for accredited support, and they, unfortunately, entered in some interaction with FSB officers, i.e., they noticed that they were under surveillance by the Federal Security Service.
Funkcjonariuszami FSB, to znaczy zauważyli, że są inwigilowani.
There is talk of some compromising materials that the Russians allegedly collected about them.
Materiałach, które Rosjanie mieli na ich temat zebrać.
The stay of the Military Counterintelligence Service officers in Russia after April the 10th also meant that offensive activities were carried out against the officers of the Polish secret services by the Russian services. Formally speaking, the Military Intelligence Service was then supposed to protect representatives of the Polish Commission investigating the Smolensk drama. Instead of protecting those people, negotiations were held to subordinate Poland to Russian services. This is the actual situation that occurred then. The services at that time, instead of protecting the Poles investigating the disaster, and they were controlled by Russia, by the Russians in a very brutal way. They were wiretapped and personally controlled. There were suspicions that their places where they lived had been searched by the Russian side.
Ich miejsca, w których mieszkali, były rewidowane przez stronę rosyjską.
Ich przygotowanie operacyjne, ich przygotowanie...
Their operational preparation, their logistical preparation, their awareness preparation was so frivolous and weak that the Poles, accredited, and other persons who were delegated by the Polish state to explain the Smolensk disaster basically did not apply any counterintelligence security
W
rules.
zasadzie nie stosowali żadnych zasad BHP kontrwywiadowczego.
They bought their own phones and cards for these phones. In Moscow, they went to pubs and to football matches. They had nothing to do in the afternoons and evenings, and they did not care about basic safety rules as regards their hotel rooms. They used strange cars, such as taxis or some semi-private transport.
Samochodami typu taksówki, czy jakiś na poły prywatny transport organizowali.
Spotkania pomiędzy ludźmi
Meetings between FSB and SKW people initially took place without any, even questionable, formal basis. It is even difficult to estimate exactly how many such meetings there were. It is known that at least 7 such meetings took place between June 2010 and April 2011. Cash reports from some of them have been preserved, so we know that they took place in this restaurant. During one of such meetings, the Russians shared with Polish officers their great experiences with the functioning of the agreement signed between the Federal Security Service and the Military Information Services, dissolved in 2006.
służbami informacyjnymi.
Nawet będąc przewodniczącym Komisji Likwidacji...
Even though I was the chairman of the WSI Liquidation Commission, I must admit I have never seen a formal agreement concluded between the Military Information Services and the Military Counterintelligence Department of the Federal Security Service.
Z materiałów już dzisiaj jawnych na temat...
But the materials that are now public and concern the cooperation between the SKW and the FSB clearly show that such an agreement has been concluded.
I mało tego, Rosjanie się na nią powoływali jako na przykład bardzo...
What's more, the Russians cited it as an example of very fruitful cooperation between the Polish military special services and the FSB. A paradoxical situation occurred, and this is something in my defense as the liquidator of the Military Information Services, because in the SKW-FSB talks, the Polish side admitted that it could not find the agreement which Colonel Grishin referred to, and he provided one of the draft documents about the cooperation between the WSI and the FSB to the Polish side. I can only say that this copy has also evaporated and is no longer available today. The military services, but also the civil services, were consciously made dependent by the then authorities on the cooperation with the Russian services. The summary, synthesis of that consisted in the decision to conclude the agreement. The Russians made this very clear. The first talks began in May 2010, a month after the attack. The Russians said very clearly that they wanted to conclude with the Polish services an agreement which was prepared by their services together with the services of the Military Information Services, i.e. the post-communist apparatus. And there, this pattern became the reference point for the agreement with the Russians, making Poland dependent on Russian secret services. Sorry, this is not something to laugh about, but there are moments when it's really hard not to laugh. Sorry. The Russians come and talk about how they would like to start cooperation, and he said, "We have already cooperated with the Polish services," and the Polish counterintelligence says that, but we don't know anything about it. And at that moment, some KGB comrade pulls it out. This is the agreement we signed once. And that's how it was. And then it disappeared from the archives altogether. Colonel Yuri Grishin was asked to bring this agreement to the next meeting, and he actually provided such material.
Taki materiał.
W czasie jednego z tych spotkań przedstawiciele
During one of the meetings, representatives of the FSB, the successor service to the KGB, provided the SKW people with a list of Chechens who were the object of interest of the Russian Secret Service.
specjalne.
17 września 2010 roku Zakajew
On the 17th of September 2010, Zakayev was detained in Poland. So we must look at this entire sequence of events and conversations, including those conducted by representatives of the Russian secret services with the Polish services. Also in such context, we know very well from diplomatic and prosecutorial documents.
Czy ja dobrze
Do I understand correctly that the key to understanding the strange behaviour of at least some of the agencies of the Polish state at that time when Ahmed Zakayev was detained is that some secret structures of the Polish state were conducting talks with obscure structures of the Russian state on matters relating to Chechnya?
rozmowy z niejawnymi strukturami państwa rosyjskiego w sprawach dotyczących Czeczenii?
Yes. Professor Piotr Gromhalski is a political scientist, journalist and publicist. He saw the war in Chechnya with his own eyes, and this is how he understands the reasons why the special services of the Russian Federation are interested in Chechnya. Russia has been eliminating successive presidents of Chechnya one by one. This shows their determination. Another important person. The most important person in this series is Zakayev. Andudiev is killed, Yedvidev is killed, Mashhodev is killed, and the consistency with which they murder successive presidents of Chechnya shows extreme banditry and extreme ferocity to crush someone who defeated them, someone who showed the whole world who humiliated Russia. And Russia is supposed to be great at this moment. Russia abandoned this course, the critical point of which was the First Chechen War. In the First Chechen War, Russia chose Putin's path. Maybe that's what it is. Mr. Mohammad Zakayev wanted to appear voluntarily. We were on our way. Both Kadyrov reacted, as did Medvedev, and Lavrov apparently decided to thank the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs on behalf of everyone. This confirms what I said. This means that the Polish authorities at that time, headed by the Prime Minister, tried to please Putin. Even though Medvedev was in charge at that time, we know who the main person was. They tried to please Putin.
Они пытались угодить Путину.
Dotychczasowe rozmowy pomiędzy
The previous talks between the FSB and the SKW began to take an official shape in March 2011. The services began to correspond with each other. The Russians write that they are still interested in the Chechen issue. The SKW writes that it wants to further tighten cooperation. At the end of August 2011, a delegation of the Federal Security Service arrives at this building, at the headquarters of the SKW.
Federalnej Służby Bezpieczeństwa.
Putin was a former director of the FSB. My point is that by 1998, everything was ready for the FSB to take power. So it could have been Primakov, it could have been Stepashin, it could have been Putin. But whoever it was, the FSB would begin to take control of the state. And that's exactly what happened with Putin. The moment he became president, he began to appoint high-ranking KGB officers, generals and colonels to major government and political positions. Some people were from the army, some were generals from the Ministry of Defense. By the end of the year 2000, virtually the entire country was controlled by the FSB, and that was the result of his first year as president.
Do końca 2000 roku właściwie cały kraj był kontrolowany przez FSB. I to był rezultat jego pierwszego roku prezydentury.
Na spotkaniu przy...
The highest-ranking representatives of Russia's most important secret service, the FSB, appeared at the meeting at Ochki Street. In December 2010, Colonel Vladimir Yushkiv entered the scene. He was formerly a councillor at the Russian embassy in Warsaw, but almost officially represented the FSB in Poland. It was Yushkiv who then became the coordinator of the cooperation between the Russian services and the Polish counterintelligence, and organised the first 2 visits of high-ranking FSB officers in the SKW headquarters in Warsaw. First, on August the 31st, 2011, Colonel General Nikolai Yuriev, first Deputy Director of the Military Counterintelligence Department of the FSB, came to the SKW. Accompanied by Major General Yuri Shepelenko from the Military Counterintelligence Department of the FSB, and previously the head of the unit of the FSB board of the Russian Federation for the 27th Missile Army.
Jeden z żołnierzy służby kontrwywiadu wojskowego.
One of the soldiers of the Military Counterintelligence Service told me some time ago that the situation in which such a high-ranking representative of the FSB as General Nikolai Yuriev, i.e. the first Deputy Director of the Military Counterintelligence of the Federal Service, appeared in the building of the Polish counterintelligence was unprecedented.
To jest sytuacja bez precedensu.
This is the first situation. The deputy head of the FSB Military Counterintelligence Department, General Yuriev, arrives from Lubyanka, enters the building on Ochki Street, and meets with the entire leadership of the Polish Military Counterintelligence. At the time, he was still accompanied by Colonel Yuri Grishin, who acted as a councillor at the embassy of the Russian Federation in Warsaw, while in fact being, as everyone knows it, as he doesn't really hide it, a colonel of the Federal Security Service, a kind of official representative of the FSB in Warsaw.
Pułkownikiem Federalnej Służby Bezpieczeństwa, rodzajem oficjalnego przedstawiciela FSB w Warszawie. I wówczas po raz pierwszy pojawia się...
In what was the first attempt on a larger scale to arrange the relations that had been going on since, say, Smolensk, but with a certain intensity since May to June 2010, to establish the relations with the military counterintelligence on a more official and formal level.
Maja, czerwca 2010 roku ułożenia tych relacji z służbą kontrwywiadu wojskowego na takiej płaszczyźnie bardziej oficjalnej i ułożonej w sensie formalnym.
17 października 2011 roku
On the 17th of October 2011, Donald Tusk received a request from General Nosek for permission to cooperate with the secret services of several countries.
ze służbami specjalnymi kilku państw. Wśród nich znajduje się taki...
Among them, there is a unique country in our history, Russia. Yes, we are talking about the document which was sent to Prime Minister Tusk by the head of the counterintelligence service, General Nosek, through the coordinator for services, Minister Ciechocki. I kindly ask you to consent to our cooperation with the special services of Algeria, Ukraine, the Russian Federation, and the People's Republic of China. Sincerely, the head of the Military Counterintelligence Services, Brigadier General Janusz Nosek.
Pamiętajmy, dotyczące...
It is a peculiar letter concerning, let us remember, a consent to conclude an international agreement. Such an international agreement is the will and willingness to sign a cooperation agreement between the SKW and the FSB,
w której
in which the Polish general and the Polish head of the Secret Service list the Russian Federation among the countries that did not sound particularly controversial to the reader of this letter. Georgia, Ukraine.
kontrowersji. Gruzja, Ukraina.
And it is written in such a way as to hide, in a sense, the Russian Federation among the other countries, because they are not listed alphabetically. In the entire stream or in the entire thread regarding the entire bloc, the countries with which we should sign some agreements between secret services.
Umowy pomiędzy tajnymi służbami. Nie chcę przez to powiedzieć, że że ta kwestia nie
I don't mean to say that this issue was not noticed by the Polish Prime Minister, who, most likely on the 18th of October, put his personal signature under this. This document of General Nosek, adding the word consent. I just want to say that the proceedings in this case raise a lot of doubts. Donald Tusk's signature on this document proves that the establishment of formal cooperation between the FSB and the Military Counterintelligence Service took place with the consent and acceptance of the Prime Minister. In the archives of the Chancellery of the Prime Minister, I saw a lot of international agreements to which Prime Minister Tusk gave consent, and they were executed, one could say, in accordance with the principles, with the letter of the law. Which means that in such situations, the Prime Minister had to be provided with a rationale. The minister in charge of a ministry that is responsible for establishing such cooperation or signing such an agreement must submit his or her recommendation along with a justification to the Prime Minister. In this case, we are dealing with something completely absurd. Prime Minister Tusk simply mechanically gave his consent. He wasn't interested in any justification. What's more, in this case, Minister Siemionak, the Minister of National Defence supervising the secret military services, did not give his consent at all. I don't think he was even asked for consent to sign that agreement in 2011. It all happened post factum, after the contract, which was signed only in 2013. Well, was initialed. Years later, Tomasz Siemoniak, who from the 2nd of August 2011 held the office of Minister of National Defence, was asked about these matters. He claims that he did not express his opinion on this matter, which opinion is required by law. There was no such opinion. However, I think this is a minor formal error, because such an opinion is not binding at all. But, Mr. Minister, for the sake of clarity, you submitted your opinion to the Prime Minister when he was taking the decision concerning this agreement. There was none. This is a formal violation, minor. Some official failed to complete the formalities here. According to the Act regulating the work of the Military Counterintelligence Service, undertaking this type of cooperation requires the consent of the Prime Minister, preceded by the opinion of the Minister of National Defence, head of the Military Counterintelligence Service and the Military Intelligence Service, each with the scope of their competence, may cooperate with competence authorities and services of other countries and with international organisations in order to implement the tasks of their subordinate services. The cooperation referred to in Act 1 may be commenced after obtaining the consent of the Prime Minister. Before giving consent, the Prime Minister shall seek the opinion of the Minister of National Defence. Donald Tusk's handwritten signature reading, "I consent" on the application regarding the cooperation between the FSB and the SKW proves not only that the Prime Minister agreed to establish this cooperation, but also that the cooperation and contacts between the Polish and Russian secret services up to that point had been carried out without such consent and were de facto illegal. This, in turn, puts all the official negotiations, talks and documents concerning the agreement and cooperation between the Military Counterintelligence Service and the FSB in a completely different light. This is how General Andrzej Kowalski, an officer of the Polish Secret Services, former head of the Military Counterintelligence Service and former head of the military service, comments on it. In fact, the agreement was only a description of a certain state that had already occurred. It was an attempt to legalize numerous meetings and conversations and vast amount of information provided. Everything happened verbally. There was no documentation. So I'm afraid that we are dealing with some kind of mystification here. This agreement, if it was not later concretized by any actual cooperation, and from what we hear in various places, it was not. Well, what was it for then? just to legalize what happened earlier. This is probably what burdens the management of the services at that time the most, that they got into a situation where they had no choice but to do something about it, because they realized that unfortunately we'd gone too far. We had already established the corporation, although it had not been formally approved yet. A week after requesting Donald Tusk's consent, Janusz Nosek invites a delegation from the FSB to another meeting to be held on the 23rd to 26th of October 2011. The director of the FSB Military Counterintelligence Department, General Alexandra Bezrykwina, together with his deputy, General Yuri Szepelenik, came to Warsaw for talks with General Nosek. They then kept the offer of cooperation with the Polish services and even proposed an appropriate agreement in this regard. A note was made to record this conversation and addressed to President Bronisław Komorowski, Prime Minister Donald Tusk, Minister of Foreign Affairs Radosław Sikorski, and Minister of National Defense Tomasz Siemoniak. None of them protested against the constant contacts between the Military Counterintelligence Service and the Federal Security Service, which had been going on for over a year. No one asked about the sense and need for establishing a close cooperation with the FSB. Half a year later, on the second anniversary of the Smolensk tragedy, the head of the Military Counterintelligence Service, General Janusz Nosek, went to Moscow for a return visit. The Russians pressed for a formalization of the cooperation. Therefore, the mutual drafting of a relevant agreement with the Russians began. In this way, a whole series of subsequent contacts with the FSB were legalized by the Military Counterintelligence Service, at the same time configuring their true nature. Notes were taken from the meeting to a very limited extent, and the contacts with the FSB were not always recorded in the reports of the Military Counterintelligence Service. Under such circumstances, General Nosek visited the FSB, formerly KGB, headquarters in Lubyanka in Moscow, on the 10th to the 12th of April 2012. And again, we are dealing with a very peculiar situation. General Janusz Nosek enters the building of the former KGB and later FSB headquarters in Moscow, Lubyanka, and he's talking there. It's April 2012.
I tam rozmawia, to jest kwiecień 2012 roku. Nie do końca wiadomo o czym.
It is not entirely clear what it was about, because the Military Counterintelligence Service does not have any report from that visit.
Jakiegokolwiek sprawozdawczego dokumentu. W zasadzie odtworzenie.
In fact, it was rather difficult to discover the fact of the trip itself, but as it involved travel abroad, there were some traces in documents.
Ze względu na to, że są jakieś ślady dotyczące wyjazdu zagranicznego, sprawa jest odnotowana w jednym z
The matter is recorded in one report very briefly. Therefore, we know about that meeting at all. Also, some photographs were taken during it. They are absolutely amazing, showing the head of the Military Counterintelligence Service greeting the head of the Military Counterintelligence Division of the Federal Security Service.
Z szefem pionu kontrwywiadu wojskowego Federalnej Służby Bezpieczeństwa.
The purpose, course and nature of these talks are still unknown. In interviews that Nosek gave years later, he was excited about meetings with Generals Bezverkny and Bortnikov, whom he said were colleagues of President Vladimir Putin, with whom they were in the same year of studies at the KGB Academy. Alexander Bortnikov continued to be the head of the FSB throughout the reset period, and then also during the war in Ukraine. He had been holding this position until the day this film is made. Half a year later, representatives of the Federal Security Services and the Military Counterintelligence Service meet again. This time, the meeting takes place at the Vistula Lagoon. Initially, the location of the meeting between the Polish and Russian delegations was planned in a completely different place. It was to take place in Tri-City, but the Russians said it was too far from the border between the Russian Federation and Poland. This is the Vistula Spit, and this place, on that side, we have the Russian Federation. On this side, we have Poland.
Z tamtej strony mamy Federację Rosyjską, po tej stronie mamy Polskę. Rosjanie z jakichś powodów...
For some reason, the Russians wanted these talks to take place relatively close, and they ensured that the talks were actually organised just a few kilometres from the border, in a place where Russians felt much safer for reasons known to themselves.
Rosjanie z sobie znanych powodów czuli się dużo bezpieczniej.
We are in Kadynia, one of the restaurants where, on the 1st of October 2012, took place, not for the first and not the last, but nevertheless important, meeting between the management of the Military Counterintelligence Service and representatives of the Federal Security Service, the Military Counterintelligence Department of the FSB, who flew here from Kaliningrad Oblast.
Z Kaliningradu, z obwodu kaliningradzkiego.
The meeting that took place in Kadynia is full of mysteries. Its detail, of course, is unknown. It is known, however, that for this occasion, representatives of the Russian side were the guests of the 9th Armoured Cavalry Brigade, base located nearby. According to our findings, they arrived there by air from the Kaliningrad Oblast. The meeting in Kadynia was only recorded in the report of the Military Counterintelligence Service for 2012. Declassified SKW documents from that time provide only partial information on this subject.
Informacje na ten temat.
The Russian delegation was led by General Smolkov. He was accompanied by several FSB officers, but probably the most important of them was Yuri Grishin's successor, the Counselor of the Embassy of the Russian Federation in Warsaw, Colonel Vladimir Yuzhvik, who, as a representative of the FSB, tried to maintain very close relations with all secret services. But he considered the Military Counterintelligence Service, where he was a frequent guest, to be the most important for these relations.
Służbę kontrwywiadu wojskowego, w której zresztą bardzo często...
He was one of the organisers, along with General Piotr Pytel, on the Polish side, of this meeting here in Kadynia on October the 1st, 2012.
W tym miejscu w Kadynach 1 października 2012 roku.
An expert-level meeting was held in Kadynia with representatives of the board of the FSB military counterintelligence for the Baltic Fleet and the troops of the Kaliningrad Oblast. We also read that there is no information about the actual course and scope of the talks. We also read in the documents that the report on the activities of the Military Counterintelligence Service for 2012 only shows that such meeting took place. I'm warning you right away that if you would like to read some note, that even if you had access to classified information and wanting to read the note from the meeting that took place here, you will not learn anything about this meeting. Well, but we learned something, and we can even show something. Yes, we probably have something that many counterintelligence officers in Poland, including employees of the Military Counterintelligence Service, have not seen. We have a video recording of this long event, which started on October the 1st, 2012 around noon and lasted for 5 hours.
Południa 1 października 2012 roku i trwa 5 godzin.
Of course, this recording is only a video recording. We have no audio recording. This is Commander Siek. This is Krzysztof Dusza in a characteristic pose with his hands in his pockets, holding an officer's sabre. Here, he will present it and they will step back. Seeing even this material is something completely unique and, one might even say, poignant, especially the situation in which an FSB general receives a symbol, one could say, of the Polish weapon, the Polish army, in the form of an officer's sabre and kisses it in front of all of the guests of General Pytel. One association, a bit family-like. As for the sabre and the Russians, my grandfather actually used it when, in 1939, he was chasing the Bolsheviks near Husno. You don't do these things like that. Russians are not such a nation, especially after 2008. After the attack on Georgia, after 2010, after what happened in Smolensk, they are not a nation that can be honoured by giving them an officer's symbol, a symbol of Polish weapons. This is shocking. Once again, we haven't talked about Aurora hats yet in this story. We'll talk about that later. Officers of the Polish army, Polish intelligence or counterintelligence, officers of special services in the common sense, the elite of the elite. They sit around with the bad guys for a few hours and they hand them sabres, completely plastered. And that's something. Well, yes, but this is only a symbolic level. The most important thing is the one that determines the substantive side of these conversations. Kadynia is only one of the places where this type of fraternizations with the Russians, the FSB and the KGB took place very often. There also were trips to Wieliczka and Zakopane. The FSB people entered the special facilities in Magdalenka, visited Kraków. It's virtual travelling circus with people from the FSB and KGB around Poland. What does it mean? What does it mean to take people in high positions of the Federal Security Service to facilities belonging to the military counterintelligence service? Maybe counterintelligence knows. Maybe that's one more thing worth saying. What is counterintelligence for? The Military Counterintelligence Division of the Federal Security Service is only called that. But in fact, it also has the competence to support intelligence activities in relation to the GRU. Do we have counterintelligence, that is, I'm sorry for plain words, to catch spies? Cooperates, drinks vodka for 5 hours at a time? In this place and in other places, and takes around people who collect information about us and our coolest facilities? Yes. But someone who is a layman will say this. Here in Kadynia, General Pytel, Colonel Dusza and Commander Siek sat in your place. On the other side sat 4 high-ranking FSB officers, some of them with the KGB past. And someone will say, well, these former Polish representatives from the SKW are some kind of official representatives of this service who are to maintain such international contacts. But the problem is bigger. It's a matter of how and where the Russians appeared before they got to the restaurant in Kadynia and how many things they saw along the way. And how many officers, soldiers, even lower-ranking drivers, in other words, people serving their visit, were exposed to the Russians.
Ich wizytę zostało zdekonspirowanych przed Rosjanami i co ci Rosjanie
and what those Russians saw in various other places in Poland. Let me remind you, they landed in military units and entered warports.
Wizytowali
They visited secret facilities that you are unable to enter. In other words, they could visit a lot of people, objects and places on this occasion.
tej okazji po prostu mogli zwiedzić, zaproszeni tutaj przez
Invited here by representatives of the management of the Military Counterintelligence Service. We were dealing with a very well thought out, extensive intelligence operation on the part of the Russians. And this is how it was. Please imagine, also included in the final report from 2014 of the Military Counterintelligence Service, which in the conclusion stated that the Russians were conducting intelligence reconnaissance here, trying to learn about the infrastructure of the Polish army, people, names. Let us also remember that soldiers and officers were exposed to these contacts under their authentic names.
Pamiętajmy też, że do tych kontaktów zostali wystawieni żołnierze, oficerowie pod swoimi autentycznymi nazwiskami.
They are, in a sense, exposed forever. Also, those who, for example, guided and welcomed on the landing pad a Russian helicopter that had landed nearby and was flying from the Kaliningrad Oblast.
I leciał z obwodu kaliningradzkiego.
According to classified materials, the signal information prepared by the Military Counterintelligence Service confirms that the agreement which Donald Tusk agreed to sign on the Polish side was a Russian initiative. The document reads as follows. The management of the FSB Military Counterintelligence Department proposed signing an agreement between the Federal Security Service and the Military Counterintelligence Service on cooperation in the field of military counterintelligence in the interest of ensuring security in accordance with the generally accepted principles and norms of international law, the national legislation of the Republic of Poland and the Russian Federation, and within their competencies. The signal information also refers to the attempt to probe the Polish services regarding helping the Russians in their approach to playing against the Georgian services, and the announcement of further visits of the Polish SKW officers in Russia. This document also announces the final signings of the agreement between the FSB and the SKW in 2013. Russian delegates also attempted to investigate the possibilities of military counterintelligence services to mediate contacts between the Federal Security Service and the Georgian secret services. Additionally, 2 visits of the Military Counterintelligence Service were planned for 2013 in the Kaliningrad Oblast and St. Petersburg. During their stay in St. Petersburg, it was planned to sign a joint agreement. A few dozen meters to the left, on the port side of our vessel, there is the border between Poland and Russia. 23 kilometers away is the city of Baltisk. And it was in this Russian city, a militarized city directly linked to the Baltic Fleet, that another meeting of the Polish and Russian secret services took place. Several photos have survived from this visit. Those conversations and meetings were not documented in any manner whatsoever. That is, apart from what we have, mainly some photographic material. We are unable to say anything about those visits. Some swimming on a pontoon, some photos against the background of Russian monuments, some smiles, walking around in sneakers, just around the city, good atmosphere. I won't tell you anything more.
Nic więcej ci nie powiem. Profesjonalizm tych ludzi, którzy to organizowali.
The professionalism of the people who organized it, who organized cooperation with the Russians in general, was the same, such as that a social meeting in Kadynia. A whole day of events in this place, including a meeting between Pytel, Siek and Dusha, with the general and his colleagues from the Federal Security Service.
z generałem i jego współpracownikami z Federalnej Służby Bezpieczeństwa.
Nie wiemy, o czym...
We don't know what was discussed in Baltisk. In fact, we don't know what was discussed here in this place either.
Powiedzmy w ten sposób, Michał.
I'm telling you, Michał, in all press enunciations, in versions as false as this book, they tell you stories about these meetings.
Oni opowiadają bajki o tych spotkaniach.
They must have held several dozen different meetings and organized this KGB, GRU, and FSB circus traveling around Poland to talk about terrorist threats, about the evacuation of the Polish contingent from Afghanistan.
O ewakuacji polskiego kontyngentu z Afganistanu,
About Chechens, about Georgians. This is just one big nonsense. I don't know what they talked about, but you really don't need so much time and so many parties, including those with alcohol, with Russians, to come to some, let's say, conclusions on such issues. The professionalism of this service is or was such as this logo, designed by General Piotr Pitel's father, a logo in which the national flag is placed in the crotch of a Polish eagle. Do you know this image of the Polish eagle, where the national flag is placed in such a place?
Gdzie flaga narodowa jest umieszczona w takim miejscu?
While the reset team of high-ranking SKW officers was in Baltisk, in the official structures of the military counterintelligence service, correspondence was already being exchanged regarding the content of the agreement between the FSB and the SKW proposed by the Russians. On the 22nd of May 2013, the SKW receives an inquiry from the Minister of Internal Affairs, Bartłomiej Cenckiewicz, regarding the agreement. The question is asked in a puzzling context. The letter reads as follows. Russian journalists citing the Kremlin press service indicate that President Putin's regulation on cooperation between the Federal Security Service and the military counterintelligence services is the result of his meeting and consultations with members of the Security Council of the Russian Federation in Sochi, devoted to discussing the situation related to threats to the Russian Federation resulting from planned withdrawal of coalition troops from Afghanistan. A moment earlier, on the 20th of May, a document appeared on the Kremlin's website, which was an order from the Russian President Vladimir Putin to sign an agreement between the Polish military counterintelligence service and the Russian Federal Security Service. Adopt the proposal of the FSB of Russia, agreed with the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs regarding the conclusion of an agreement between the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation and the Military Counterintelligence Service of the Republic of Poland on cooperation and common operations in the field of military counterintelligence. Russia's FSB will hold talks with the Polish side and, after reaching an agreement, will sign the above-mentioned agreement, signed by the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. This information was included in the daily briefings sent to the Minister of Internal Affairs and probably chilled him. This situation simply caused some alert, some crisis, some question appeared. What in the world are you planning there in Oczki? I don't know whether Cenckiewicz had just learned then that these contacts were being maintained and whether he was aware of what they looked like. However, the fact is that the Russians, it is very interesting and it should be analysed more thoroughly and interpreted in a more serious manner. The Russians preventatively, before the formal signing of the agreement between the SKW and the FSB, which took place on September the 11th, 2013, with this message on the website of the President of the Russian Federation, exposed the entire cooperation between the FSB and the SKW. This is extremely important because the agreement of 11th of September 2013 states that all this cooperation and this agreement remain secret and cannot be publicized. Ultimately, Putin decided to sign the FSB's agreement with the SKW after a conversation with Patrushev in Sochi. Yes, this Patrushev, who at that time was conducting a strategic dialogue with General Kozier and the Polish National Security Bureau. The SKW people involved in contacts with Russians were not impressed by the publication of the Kremlin statement. The case was still being processed. The agreement was translated into Polish. Amendments are proposed. Finally, on September the 6th, a week before signing the agreement, they were handed over to Colonel Vladimir Juszczyk, the FSB representative in Warsaw. The wording of the SKW-FSB agreement, which was concluded in St. Petersburg on the 11th of September 2011 between General Nosek and Colonel Bezverny, was being drafted at that time. It was on the occasion of signing this agreement that photos were taken in which the heads of the military counterintelligence service, Piotr Pytel and Janusz Nosek, posed in the caps of Russian soldiers from the Aurora cruiser, the cruiser the gunshots from which began the criminal history of communist Russia. For me, it's incomprehensible that a Polish officer did not feel that all this was a symbol of Bolshevism. Whatever it is, a Pole cannot touch it at all. He cannot participate in it. This is not a reality we can even agree on. Well, unfortunately, in this case, something was missing. I can only say I'm sorry that there were also officers from the service that I was also once from. Both of them were in the State Protection Office, and yet they lacked the basic sensitivity that a Polish officer should be proud of. What is Bolshevik? He does not touch. The FSB-SKW cooperation agreement remained the subject of discussion and speculation for years. We are presenting the content of this document to the public for the first time. First of all, it must be said that the entire document, also in Polish, was prepared by Russians. You could say that their signature, the main evidence, although we know it, we just know it nevertheless is a specific Polish language used this document. The word oboe appears several times there, meaning a musical instrument. Yes, oboe, open as plural meaning the two countries, i.e. both countries, signed the agreement. The legal department of the Military Counterintelligence Service, after the consultation with the management of the service, provided the Russians with comments both on the quality of the Polish language used in this agreement and several merit-related issues, including Article 6 thereof. But when Nosek, Pytel and Dusha flew to St. Petersburg to sign this agreement, believing that everything had been agreed with the Russians, probably already holding a pen to sign it, he realized that the Russians had not introduced any of their comments, and yet he signed this document in two copies, in the Polish and in the Russian language version.
Ten dokument został przez niego podpisany w dwóch egzemplarzach. W polskiej wersji i w rosyjskojęzycznej wersji.
This is important because they slightly differ from each other and because one of the articles of this agreement states that both the Polish and Russian versions are in force and have the same power and meaning. Wait, I'll interrupt for a second and ask you a question. If the two documents or two versions of the document differ, i.e. the Polish version is different and the Russian version is different, and both are valid, does it mean that the meaning of this document is from both versions? How do they differ?
Zarówno w jednej, jak i w drugiej wersji. Czego dotyczy ta różnica?
The controversy concerns the provision of Article 6, or rather the end of this provision. The procedure of exchange of information, I quote now, containing data constituting classified information, as well as the procedure of further protection of such information are specified, among others, in an intergovernmental agreement. Sorry, I read it as it is. Poor Polish. The Russian version states that they are not defined by other intergovernmental agreements.
Nie są określone innymi międzyrządowymi porozumieniami.
This means that they are and are not the same.
To już jest pytanie do
It is a question which Colonel Nosek should be asked. Why did he sign such a document? But that's not why this document is terrible in itself. The worst thing about this document is something else, and mainly from this perspective. I treat it as an act of treason.
zdrady. Ten dokument nigdy nie powinien zostać.
This document should never be signed by any Polish official, especially the head of the secret military counterintelligence service.
Mianowicie
Namely, first of all, it was not handled in accordance with the rules, the principles of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was not consulted, contrary to what Nosek, Pytel and others say in their various press interviews.
w różnych swoich prasowych wywiadach. Po drugie,
Secondly, it actually contradicts the agreement which is the most important for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, i.e., the Washington Treaty. And that's what I'm getting at. Article 2, point B states,
czyli traktatem waszyngtońskim. I do czego zmierzam?
the parties shall provide each other with assistance in the following main areas of cooperation in the field of military counterintelligence. And now, in counteracting subversive intelligence activities of special services of third countries directed against it. First always, the Russian Federation or the Republic of Poland.
Lub Rzeczpospolitej Polskiej.
Article 8 of the North Atlantic Treaty states that none of the NATO member states may conclude international agreements that would be inconsistent with the treaty. The relevant provision reads as follows.
Następująco.
Each party declares that none of the international engagements now in force between it and any other of the parties or any third state is in conflict with the provisions of this treaty, and undertakes not to enter into any international engagement in conflict with this treaty. Here we are dealing with something that I would classify as treason. Who are those third countries that conduct intelligence and subversive activities against the Russian Federation? It may be every other country other than Poland or the Russian Federation. Also, our NATO allies. Don't the Russians qualify British or American activities precisely as conducting intelligence and subversive activities against the Russian Federation? Where is the exclusion of our NATO allies? Where is the point that says that this agreement does not apply to the issue that they are regulated by Poland's participation in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization?
Które są regulowane faktem uczestnictwa Polski w Pakcie Północnoatlantyckim.
Ale przecież tak zrozumiany i tak napisany.
Although this agreement, understood and written this way and signed this way, directly obligates the Polish side, if we take it seriously, to spy together with Russia on, for example, the American, British or any other allied services. Any.
Na przykład amerykańskich, na przykład brytyjskich, czy jakichkolwiek innych sojuszniczych.
In general, according to the principle that we exchange information with the Russian Federation regarding, if we find out that someone is conducting activities against the Russian Federation, then we must cooperate in this matter and notify the Russian Federation. Certain areas of cooperation outlined there are such that they should at least make your hands shake. Well, if the head of the service reads that, he has, it is precisely written here, that to counteract the intelligence and subversive activities of the special services of the third countries directed against the Russian Federation, that is, if the head of the Polish service is aware, has information about the fact that any allied services conduct activities against Russia, what should he do with this information? Should he respect this agreement, or should he respect Allied obligations? Where are we? We are in a very strange position. because on the one hand, we are a NATO ally, where we have very strict agreements with special services within NATO. And on the other hand, we undertake to inform Russia about anything in this area. It can't be consummated at all. This is a completely unimaginable thing. How can one function in such a dichotomy? You can't have both at the same time, either one or the other. I'm not a lawyer, so of course you can always say that maybe I'm wrong, but I was the head of the service. I would never sign it as the head of the service. Why? Simply because I know where the important obligations are, and I cannot enter into other obligations that would conflict with those more important obligations. A natural situation. Years ago, in his book Poland, Russia, Professor Andrzej Nowak wrote about this agreement. 2013, the agreement signed by the FSB and the Polish secret services. I would say that even today, a man who, by the way, it seems some action may have taken against him, who represented our Polish secret services back then, very often speaks in the media such as Onet and WP in defense of this arrangement, and with indignation that we broke off this fruitful cooperation with the heir to the KGB and GRU. I'd say all this already shows some kind of pyramid of absurdity, to which led this, pardon the colloquial language, flat denial by the government, which made a catastrophic mistake at the beginning of its term of office, the mistake of agreement with Putin's Russia.
Kiedy jesteś blisko wszystkich naszych myśli, staje się realne to, co nam się przyśni, i wszystkie słowa wypowiedziane, bo jesteś naszym wrogiem albo naszym kołem.